apologies, particularly to my fellow speakers. I got in late to Washington last night from Peru, and my flight this morning from Washington to Atlanta was delayed. I'm here, but I didn't hear. I'm here, but I didn't hear what was said before me. My topic is debate, definition, and difficulty, good, evil, ethics, and morality in the Abrahamic and Hindu traditions. The source for answering ultimate questions, including how to define good and evil, and how to shape an ethical and moral code, is found in most, if not all, religious traditions in texts, both oral and written, that are believed to have come from a divine source and revealed through sacerdotal intermediaries, called in the English language prophets. There is, however, a significant difference between revelation and the legislation of what constitutes proper, good, moral, ethical behavior, for the legislation is a consequence of the interpretive process to which the revelation has been subject. What is decreed by God is construed by humans. As one might expect, then, religious literature comes in two primary forms, that which constitutes revelation and that which constitutes the interpretation of revelation, either directly or indirectly. In Judaism, for instance, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the prophetic books that follow, canonized by 140 CE as the Hebrew Bible, constitute the totality of revealed literature. The rabbinic tradition that either directly interprets passages from the Bible, this would be called Midrash, or that instructs Jews in how properly to act vis-a-vis both God and other humans, that would be called Talmud, offers its prescriptions based on explicit or implicit interpretations of biblical and therefore divine thought. Similarly, Christianity, which views the Hebrew Bible as an Old Testament, reflecting an earlier covenant, supplemented and to a certain extent superseded by a new covenant, articulated in the New Testament, canonized by 395 CE, develops rich patterns of direct and indirect interpretation referred to as patristic and scholastic literature. Indeed, the very term Bible, as it is variously used by Jews, Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, Ethiopian Christians, each of which groups differs from the others with regard to precisely what is considered canon, reflects extended acts of interpretive discussion. Thus, what constitutes revelation and not revelation, and not merely how to understand and legislate based on revelation, is dependent upon interpretation. This pattern of revelation and the double issue of interpreting which texts are revealed and which are not, and of producing literatures that are specifically designed to interpret the revelation directly or indirectly, continues within the Abrahamic traditions with the advent of Islam. Islam's consummate revealed text, the Quran, organized by 634-5 or so by the Caliph Uthman, is shortly accompanied by a body of work, hadith, unlike anything in Judaism or Christianity. Hadiths often speak about the Prophet Muhammad, sometimes in a manner that interpret as they embellish some laconic statement in the Quran. Think, for example, of the Isra, which is so laconically presented in the 17th surah, first ayat of the Quran, which becomes a much more elaborate discussion by way of hadith of not only Isra, but Mir'aj and all that that implies. Some hadiths offer the words of Muhammad himself, but in his own capacity, not in his Quranic role as a conduit through whom God speaks. Beyond hadith, there unfolds a vast body of interpretive literature associated with the Sharia, from the root shar, meaning a path that leads one to water in the wilderness, that over the centuries offers different directions and thus different interpretations of the Quran that depend in their diversity on whether the interpretation engages Shi'i or Sunni Muslims, and within these two large categories derives from this or that school of Sharia. This somewhat complex overall framework is refracted into ongoing patterns of explicit and implicit debate regarding the meaning of God's word and how what is revealed is understood to legislate proper human conduct. The debates either reflected directly in these literatures of interpretation or understood to be a consequence of debate include both the overall question and the many specific and particular details or instances of what might be called ethics and morality. Thus, for instance, the prescription found in the Bible in Exodus 20 and repeated in Deuteronomy 5, "Thou shalt not commit murder," commonly known as the Sixth Commandment, immediately provokes the question of what constitutes murder. If I kill a man in self-defense, is that murder? If I execute a murderer, is that murder? If I crush a mosquito on my arm, is that an act of murder? What of the passage in Genesis 1:26 that humans shall, quote, "have dominion over," end of quote, the other animals? Does dominion imply the right to do with other species as we see fit in terms of our own needs and desires? Or does it imply responsibility for caretaking them all? How ought one to understand the passage in Quran 2:29 that parallels that in Genesis, in which God refers to his intention to create a vice-regent, a khalifa, in and on the earth? Both of these statements are offered in the context of the narrative of Adam and Eve, their subsequent act of eating from the tree from which Adam was directly told by God not to eat, leads in three directions with regard to ethics, morality, good and evil. They firstly are exiled, of course, from the Garden of Eden. Secondly, their act is viewed as sinful in all three traditions, but in Christianity, that sin labeled original sin is deemed so egregious, as interpreted in the writings of St. Augustine in the late 4th, early 5th century, a key patristic thinker, that only the extraordinary intervention of God itself in human form as Jesus can lead to salvation for humans who are the descendants of Adam and Eve and bear the ineradicable imprint of that first sin on their souls. Judaism's interpretation is far less extreme. Adam and Eve made a very bad choice, abused the divine gift of free will in abrogating God's direct command. But their act is not an absolute and unique sort of sin inherently affecting every subsequent human being, and the punishment is not as dire as in Christian thought. There is, in fact, no proper word for hell in Hebrew, and thus there is no need or expectation of an extraordinary act of salvation. Islam reads the story through the narrative in the Quran, not the Bible. And in the Quran, the statement is explicit in Quran chapter 17, verse 15, that one's sins are one's own and not those inherited from ancestors like Adam and Eve. The third direction toward which the biblical narrative of Adam and Eve in Genesis leads is directly, as it were, to the story of Noah. For at the beginning of Genesis 6, when we are introduced to him, we're informed that virtually everybody else in the world beside him is evil, and that therefore God has decided to destroy them all. What is intriguing in this is that there is absolutely no explanation of what it is that they have done that makes them evil. Surely they're not being punished for the act of Adam and Eve, who were themselves punished generations earlier with exile and arguably the murder of one of their sons at the hands of the other. The only other divine commandment in the first 5 chapters of Genesis, besides that not to eat from that tree, had been to be fruitful and multiply, clearly a commandment that had been fulfilled and followed, not abrogated, by Adam and Eve and their descendants, or there would not have been so many people by the time of Noah to be swallowed up by a flood as the recompense for their evil. Thus we realize that what constitutes evil and what we might understand as the basis for thinking ethically or unethically, morally or immorally, is not as simple or clear in the revelation of Genesis and its Jewish, Christian, and Islamic reflections as we might suppose. We're required to interpret the revelation, and any time we humans engage in that act, we are likely to disagree on what constitutes the correct interpretation. The question of revelation and interpretation is no more simple if one turns outside the Abrahamic tradition to Hinduism. You'll have to buckle your seatbelts here. The term Hinduism itself is a misnomer, as you may know, since it simply really means India-ism, and since it implies a common form of faith, whereas what we call Hinduism is diverse with respect, among other things, to its sense of God. As a convenience, one may, and I shall, use the term Hinduism, but we must understand the following, at least. Hinduism is both monotheistic and very comfortable understanding the one God to be manifest through a large number of articulations that go by different god names. Thus, to be oversimple, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva are the three primary male expressions of Godhead. I'm ignoring, just for time, the female expression. That's the only reason, time. In an oversimplified way, Brahma is understood as the creative aspect of God. Vishnu preserves the creation, and Shiva is associated with its destruction, a destruction, however, that yields further creation in an eternal cycle of creation, destruction, creation. To a Brahmanite, Brahma is the consummate articulation of God. To a Vaishnavite, Vishnu is, and to a Shaivite, Shiva is. But nobody denies the legitimate reality of the other articulations. Nor is it that simple. Vishnu, for instance, has many different avatars. He has taken different forms at different times in order to intervene in the world of humans to help us. One of those avatars is a bluish, blackish-skinned human, Krishna. And Krishna develops his own devotees who see him as the consummate expression of God. Thus, what for Vaishnavites is one among many avatars of Vishnu is for Krishnaites the articulation of the Absolute. Hinduism furthermore distinguishes between two fundamental literatures, revealed literature, called in Sanskrit Shruti, meaning heard, and Smrti, literally meaning remembered. Texts like the Vedas are understood to be Shruti, and epic poems like the Mahabharata are understood to be Smrti. However, embedded within the Mahabharata is a chapter that takes on its own life, called the Bhagavad Gita, the divine song. In other words, what for Krishnaites is the consummate textual revelation of the views of the consummate articulation of God, Krishna, is for non-Krishnaites merely an important chapter of a vast Smrti battle epic. The content of the Bhagavad Gita briefly is this, that the warrior Kshatriya, Arjuna is his name, leads his troops against his blind uncle and cousins, because his uncle, who had raised Arjuna from childhood after Arjuna's father's death, had usurped the throne that should have passed Arjuna when he reached manhood. Arjuna is privileged to have Krishna himself as his charioteer. And when the young prince begins to doubt whether he should in fact begin the battle against his uncle's army, distressed that he will win or lose, kill people, including those who are near and dear to him, Krishna's response to this concern becomes an extended instruction in Sanskrit dharma on how and what one should do to achieve the moral perfection that can lead to moksha, release from the ongoing cycle of life, death, and to a condition of nirvana, a term referring to a state, not a location, like paradise in the Abrahamic traditions, of being one with Krishna. Specifically, Krishna tells Arjuna that what he is doing is attempting to restore the proper order, again that word dharma, of things, since he, Krishna, God himself, was the one who established that order. His blind uncle, who upset it by usurping the throne, should not be king. He further instructs Arjuna that the very concern that the prince has expressed regarding family and community underscores why he must fight, for he is a Kshatriya, a warrior, in a fourfold God-ordained caste system in which each segment of society has its God-appointed role. So, to fight and to kill is to maintain and restore the proper order of things. Additionally, Krishna says to him, you can't really kill those whom you fight. All you can do is destroy their bodies, which are physical carapace, a temporary housing for the soul, the Atman, a housing that is absolutely pure illusion, Maya. The real individual is the Atman of that individual, which is indestructible. There is more, of course, but for our purposes, this part of the discussion will suffice, for it brings us full circle to the problem posed in Exodus 20 and the question of what it means to kill and how that differs from the notion of committing murder. A member of the Abrahamic tradition would not likely feel comfortable with the Krishnite promise that if one's soul has achieved sufficient perfection to merit moksha and nirvana, the outcome will be a complete dissolution of the individual soul, which becomes subsumed into being itself, in this case, understood to be personified as Krishna. Members of these other traditions value the individuality of the soul too much. So we understand in the end that all of these traditions, in order to be properly understood, require an enormous amount of effort to interpret the revelation, and even deciding what constitutes revelation is a matter of interpretation. Schools of thought, and literally schools, can teach about morality, it can even presume to teach morality, but the best ones follow a kind of Socratic path, that of dialogue and discussion, review and rethinking. The best schools and the most important schools of thought recognize the significance of training students and adherents to think, whether about good and evil, morality and ethics, or other issues. To be fully human, Socrates and Plato said, and they were neither Jewish nor Christian nor Muslim nor Hindu, is to be engaged consistently and constantly in thinking, in cross-examining one's own and others' thoughts and conclusions, in discussing and debating, and as such, to recognize that revelation is not the end of the process of operating as a species in league with the God who made us. Revelation is the beginning. It is our constant attention to exploration of debating about the meaning of revelation, not only in the abstract, but with regard to living our lives in the concrete everyday world, all of which are components of the process of interpretation that turns God's word into laws by which we can and should live. This is what the interpretive traditions engage at their best. The debate that is explicit within the rabbinic tradition, every issue that is raised regarding the Torah or drawn from everyday life, with an implicit turn to the Torah, typically presents different points of view. It is what one recognizes in the plethora of patristic and scholastic thinkers who directly or implicitly engage each other across the centuries. It's what we can identify in the proliferation of shariahs, plural, across the Muslim world over the centuries. Debate, discussion, dialogue is present explicitly or by implication. This is what is emphatically present in the contemporary movement known as Hizmet. The ideology of dialogue and creative debate is reflected in the Hizmet movement and in the writings of Fethullah Gulen, who has already been mentioned at least once, probably many times, whose preaching and teaching have inspired the movement. Among the myriad accomplishments of Hizmet, designed to fulfill the dictum that we connect to God and to God's love when we connect to each other and act lovingly to each other, none is more noteworthy than the founding of hundreds and hundreds of schools across this planet, whose point and purpose is in large part to help solve the problem of human conflict by training students from elementary school to university level to think, to cross-examine their own and each other's thoughts, to recognize the essential role that humans must play in shaping an ethical and moral world, a role played when we don't limit ourselves to the revelation as a guide, but push ourselves to engage the revelation in dialogues of interpretation in which we also recognize the limits of each of our abilities to know the answers absolutely, and to open ourselves to the sharing and combining together of our diverse understandings in an effort to approach ethical and moral truth. Thank you.